Okay, we are live. This is Local History and Genealogy Live. I am Sierra, and I'm from the Local History and Genealogy Department at Covington. I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes to find the video and get in here and get comfortable. And today we have a local author with us, Peter Bronson. He's going to present his new book about Newport called Forbidden Fruit: Sin City's Underworld and the Supper Club Inferno. So I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes to get in here, and we will get started in a little bit. All right. I see some of you have joined. So I am going to start the process of getting Peter's presentation going. But before I do that, I wanted to introduce him. Peter Bronson is the author of Forbidden Fruit and several other books. He was an editorial page editor and columnist for the Cincinnati Enquirer for nearly 20 years. He has been a TV host and panelist, magazine writer, and radio guest in Cincinnati and Tucson, and he lives in Milford. Give me a second here to get his PowerPoint and his video going, and once I do that, I'll let him know he's live. Okay, Peter, you are live.
Thank you, Sierra. Hey, welcome everybody to Forbidden Fruit, Sin City's Underworld and the Supper Club Inferno. As we used to say in the newsroom when I was working at the Enquirer for 20 years, mobsters, hookers, murder and dice, crooked cops, dirty politicians, and cold-blooded hitmen. This story has it all. So let's take a look at the local history. This is an exciting tour through real history. That's the best part. If you grew up in Cincinnati or have paid any attention to local history, you probably remember what was probably the biggest story ever in Cincinnati and northern Kentucky, which is the Supper Club fire on May 28, 1977. 165 people lost their lives, and this may be the greatest cold case unsolved mass murder in U.S. history. You probably remember, if you were reading the papers at the time, the huge crowds of detectives and fire investigators who combed through the wreckage and sifted through the ashes looking for remains of the victims and evidence. Some of the evidence and remains they found was heartbreaking. They had boxes of eyeglasses, wallets, car keys, stray shoes, pieces of clothing. These things speak to the lives that were lost and the great time people expected at that club. They were dressed in their finest. They came from all over our region, as far away as Alabama and California, but generally from Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia and throughout the Midwest. Even if you don't remember that history, you probably drove past this memorial on top of the hill in Southgate, where the Supper Club burned in 1977. The memorial was put up by Wayne Dammert, who was the bell captain that night during the fire, the banquet captain, and he saved 75 people on the second floor of the club, and has dedicated, ever since, been dedicated to keeping the memory of the victims alive and preserving their memorial and helping people understand what happened. He was one of the great heroes. What people may not have ever known or forgotten was that the Beverly Hills Supper Club was originally the Beverly Hills Country Club. On the same hilltop, it was the jewel of nightclubs in northern Kentucky, and there were a lot of nightclubs in northern Kentucky. Nearly all of them offered illegal gambling, prostitution, drugs, crime, extortion, bribery, whatever you name it, it was endemic to the region. This was one of what they called the carpet clubs, which were the high-end, high-class places. The low-end places with crooked games and a lot of violence were called the bust-out joints. So Beverly Hills Country Club was the ultimate club in the Midwest. The owner was a guy named Pete Schmidt, who was underworld character. He was a numbers guy, and here he is with the Newport police, and they were his friends. No doubt he had plenty of problems at the club, but they were his friends because the Newport police were very crooked and paid by the mob in those days. And Pete Schmidt was originally a member of the George Remus mob, who was, George Remus was the biggest bootlegger in the US and put Cincinnati on the map for bootlegging. When he went to prison, most of his gang went with him, and Pete Schmidt was one of those. But when those guys came out and had served their time, they immediately opened clubs throughout northern Kentucky, and Pete Schmidt had the nicest one. Here's a look at what visitors would be greeted by as they came into the bar at the Beverly Hills Country Club. It was spectacular. It was by far the prettiest, most high-class place in the Midwest, with ultimately the most fantastic entertainment, people like Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis and all the Hollywood stars. A lot of them came through northern Kentucky to perform at the Beverly Hills. Unfortunately for Pete Schmidt, one of his visitors was the leader of the Cleveland mob, Mo Dalitz. He led the Cleveland Four mob, and when he saw this club, he decided he had to have it. Pete Schmidt said no, and the Cleveland Four and Mo Dalitz had some guys go burn him out. When they set the club on fire, it was supposed to be unoccupied, but it turns out a caretaker was there with his girlfriend and his girlfriend's sister. The little girl, the sister, was 5 years old. She was thrown from a window while the club burned and died a few days later of massive burns. She was the first casualty at the Hilltop, as far as we know, the first casualty of the Hilltop where the Beverly Hills Supper Club burned. The guys they picked up for it were three police characters, as they were known in the headlines of the day. One of them was a cafe owner named Dave Whitfield, who was connected to the mob, and two others, Chick Deem and Edwin Garrison, also mob guys. Edwin Garrison had the distinction of being one of the few people to make the FBI most wanted list several times because of his escapes from prison, and he was a math whiz. He and Chick Deem were immediately convicted and sent to the penitentiary in Kentucky. Dave Whitfield had better mob connections, was probably one of the ringleaders, and he fought through 3 trials and ultimately was convicted and sent to prison. But immediately on his release, he was given a job managing the Latin Quarter Club, which was another mob club. Well, all these burnouts and mob guys were pretty much taken for granted in northern Kentucky as part of the bargain that was made to get bootleg booze during Prohibition. However, killing a 5-year-old girl, most people agreed, crossed the line. And a backlash of public disapproval began to grow. And there was one judge who stood up to fight back. And his name was Judge Johnst, with an ST, Northpet. He was the Kenton County judge in Covington, and he was known as a very active judge, a tough guy, fearless. The mob lawyers accused him of carrying a machine gun on some raids, and he denied it and replied, "No, I didn't need a machine gun. Machine guns were discussed, but we decided rifles and handguns would be enough." So this guy was no nonsense and one of the heroes of the region. There should be a statue to Judge Northcutt somewhere in northern Kentucky. When the mob took over the Beverly Hills, it began to soon take a closer look at the biggest rival of the Beverly Hills, and that was the Lookout House, also a carpet joint, which was drew a high-class crowd. it was owned by another George Remus gangster named Buck Brady. When the mob decided to take over the Lookout House, it sent their enforcer, Red Masterson. It's widely acknowledged and known that Red Masterson was also a member of the raid and the arson team that burned out the Beverly Hills Country Club. He was seen by a witness carrying gas cans to his car that night and was asked by a gas pump jockey, where are you going? And he said, you'll read about it in the paper tomorrow. So Red Masterson was a really bad dude. He carried 238s and was not at all hesitant to use them, including shooting down a Chicago hitman on the streets of Newport in broad daylight. Well, Red Masterson came to Buck Brady and said, we're taking your club. And Buck Brady didn't like that, so he waited for Red to leave his merchants club in Newport. And as Red was driving away, Buck opened fire with double-up buckshot and tried to kill Red. He was unsuccessful, which was his big mistake. His fellow gang members ran for Cincinnati across the bridge, and Buck ran to an outhouse where he was caught. However, when they interviewed Red in the hospital, he said it was no big deal and refused to press charges. The case was dropped. The country club, the Beverly Hills Country Club, was really a special place. This picture taken in the 60s shows what it looked like when the mob ran it. The Cleveland gang made sure it was first class all the way. As I said, they spared no expense to get the best stars. It was truly like a night on the town at your country club, however, with the added value of casinos included. So you would have craps tables, roulette, slot machines, blackjack, whatever the gambler's heart desired, it was available at the country club. And truly, it was an unforgettable night on the town for people from all over the Midwest and became known as the showplace of the nation. Pete Schmidt, when he was forced out of the Beverly Hills Country Club, opened a new place in Newport, which he called Glenn Schmidt's, named after his son. Many will recognize this as the current home of the Syndicate restaurant. Before it was the Syndicate, it was also known as Glenn Schmidt's Platorium, which was a really clever name that captured perfectly the sense that Newport, which was also called Sin City and Little Mexico, was Cincinnati's playground. It was the Platorium. How wild was Northern Kentucky? It's really hard to exaggerate. This is Big Jim Harris, also known as Boss Man. He was the town marshal in Wilder and also openly ran his own brothel called the Heidi Ho Club. His special twist on the business was to wire all the rooms for sound and make sure that the women he employed asked certain key questions from the visitors who were usually attending conventions in Cincinnati. And then when these gentlemen would go back to Chicago, Detroit, or Lexington, wherever they'd come from, a few weeks later, Big Jim would give them a call and play the tape. Well, they were glad to spend thousands of dollars to buy those tapes, and he made a lot more from the Heidi Ho Club than he ever made as town marshal. So that just shows you how deeply law enforcement was corrupted. In the 1950s, television was a brand new thing, and it was still competing with radio until the Kefauver hearings came along. They became the sensation of the nation. Estes Kefauver, a senator from Tennessee, led the committee that investigated organized crime in America. And he brought before his committee all the big names, including Frank Costello, who became the model for the Marlon Brando character in The Godfather. Most of the crime, underworld and organized crime movies that we've seen in Hollywood used as models a lot of the testimony that happened before the Kefauver hearing. And America was glued to their tiny black and white TV screens to watch these mobsters invoke the Fifth Amendment and lie. And in the case of Mo Dalitz at Wright, he was very charming. He was almost a comedian with his answers. But he was thoroughly dishonest. He pretended that he said at one point, "I've never had any publicity." Well, of course, that was by design. He didn't want publicity. He ran one of the biggest organized crime networks in America, which had been granted when the mob met in a summit in the 20s and divided the nation into regions. He had his region of the Midwest, and that included the Beverly Hills Country Club and many other clubs. In the early 1960s, another reform movement kicked off and really grew fast. It was called the Committee of 500. And they chose as their leader, the guy to run for sheriff, was George Ratterman, who was an all-American guy, an outstanding athlete, a football star at Notre Dame and in the pros. And he had come back after his pro career to be an investment counselor. When his neighbors started talking about how bad organized crime and corruption was in northern Kentucky, he decided that he would run for sheriff. And if anything, the mob underestimated George Ratterman. Ratterman, when the mob figured out that he could possibly win against their candidate, who was Johnny TV Peluso, they decided to set him up and frame him. They had one of their guys, the owner of the Tropicana Club, Tito Carizzi, invite him to the club and set him up with a stripper in a bedroom and gave him chloral hydrate knockout props to frame him so that he could take pictures and basically either destroy his candidacy or make sure that they owned him if he was elected. However, he went immediately to the media, had a blood test, and proved that he had been given knockout props, and the whole thing backfired. When the new attorney general at the time was Bobby Kennedy, appointed by his brother Jack. And although the mob believed the Kennedys were in their pockets, because Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana often bragged openly that he had delivered the election to Jack Kennedy by fixing it in Chicago. The mob was shocked to find that now Bobby was going to lead a crusade against the mob. It was the ultimate betrayal, and Bobby chose as his first target the Ratterman case in Newport. And he sent his chief deputy, Ron Goldfarb, to Newport to prosecute the mob on federal charges in federal courts, giving him a blank check to destroy the mob in northern Kentucky. Meanwhile, Bobby Kennedy had a very hostile and almost violent battle going on with Jimmy Hoffa, who was the leader of the Teamsters and was deeply involved in organized crime. Many of the mob casinos that Mo Dalitz and his friends opened in Vegas in the 60s and 70s were financed with Teamsters pension funds. Bobby Kennedy knew this, and his feud with Jimmy Hoffa was legendary. So we had two Kennedys in two Newports. Here's a picture of the glamorous President JFK sailing his yacht off Newport, Rhode Island, where he owned a huge estate. And then there was Bobby, involved in a very different Newport in Kentucky, where he was battling for his life, as it turned out, against organized crime. Here's a picture of JFK when he came to Newport in 1959 to campaign for president. It's a prophetic picture in its way because he's in an open car. He is in a motorcade, which was a tradition in those days for politicians, but it obviously has been abandoned ever since what happened to Jack Kennedy in Dealey Plaza in 1963 when he was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald and assassinated. Well, the most interesting thing I found in my research of this book was that these events are very closely connected to Newport. While Bobby Kennedy was fighting the mob, George Ratterman was also fighting what was left of the mob in northern Kentucky, and the leader at that time was a guy named Screw Andrews. When he went, here he is serving a warrant on Screw Andrews, and while he was doing that, the Newport police ticketed his sheriff's car, which just goes to show the dynamic and titanic battle between the crooked Newport police and George Ratterman and his team of what he called his own untouchables who were clean deputies that he hired after he fired all the rest of the Kenton County Sheriff's Department. Pardon me, Campbell County Sheriff's Department. When Ratterman and Kennedy pushed most of the high-profile mobsters out of northern Kentucky, their vacuum was filled by what I call disorganized crime. Those years in the 70s were the golden age of porn in America. X-rated movies had gone mainstream. People were renting videos and going to adult clubs, watching XXX movies. It was an amazing thing, really, because the Supreme Court had pretty much opened the door for this kind of thing throughout the country, and there were very few cities that didn't have a seedy sin strip, and Newport was probably among the worst. Porn took over Newport, and the city just declined, although there were politicians at the time, including the mayor, who was Johnny TV Peluso, and he insisted that porn was the best business and the best tourist draw that Newport could expect. This enraged reformers who eventually replaced him, and Newport was eventually cleaned up in the 90s. Now, in 1969, Dick Schilling decided to buy the old Beverly Hills Country Club, which was at the time boarded up and abandoned since it was a casino. And no sooner did he buy it and begin to remodel it than it was torched again in 1970. The fire was arson, almost undoubtedly. The state police were ambivalent, but the local fire marshal and inspector said he had no doubt that it was arson. In fact, he'd even received a phone call tip as the fire was being set. And then again in 1977, the Beverly Hills was burned again. Here we see pictures of the crowd, the lucky ones, congregating outside the club as it burns. They did their best to rescue people, hauling out as many as they could, but it was a horrible and horrific scene. And the lower right gives you just a hint of that, with the crews that were drawn from every fire department in the region, working furiously and tirelessly throughout the night to rescue and retrieve victims. One of the unlikely heroes was Walter Bailey. He was a busboy who, while others were trying to contain the fire at the front of the club in the Zebra Room, he calmly walked on stage and interrupted a comedy act in the Cabaret Room, where hundreds and hundreds of people were gathered to see John Davidson perform. Walter Bailey calmly interrupted the act and told people that they should leave because there was a fire in the club. Unfortunately, many had been drinking heavily, and others thought that this was part of the comedy act. They ignored him, and they paid the price. Immediately after the fire, we can see here how evidence was destroyed. The fire began in the Zebra Room, which is indicated by the gouge in the wall in the photo to the right. That's where the cranes attacked first, as you can see in the photo to the left. Almost immediately after the fire, the scene of the fire, which contained possible crime scene evidence, was destroyed, covered up, and basically lost to any kind of forensic study. This, according to the survivors, the people who were there, was no accident, and the destruction of the evidence was deliberate. We see here the scene in the basement below the Zebra Room. The survivors, including David Brock, who was a busboy that night, have fought for years, and after years of battling the Kentucky State Police to release photos, they obtained this. This is a photo taken by the state police photographer as he gained access to the lower level before the Zebra Room was destroyed. Now, at the time before they obtained this photo, the state police were still insisting there was no fire in the lower level or the basement. But we can see clearly here scorch marks on the wall, scorch marks on the ductwork, intense signs of intense fire throughout the lower level. And this is directly below the Zebra Room. Here we see one of these ducts that is apparently blown up. You can see the twisted metal and the signs of intense fire, the scorch marks on the surrounding equipment. The evidence for arson, and this is just a small part of it, includes, for example, the fact that the people who showed up on the scene and insisted that arson was not a possibility totally had to ignore the fact that every year in northern Kentucky, a major nightclub or restaurant had been burned to the ground, and in all cases, they were considered suspicious fires, and in some cases, there was evidence of accelerants indicating arson. In many cases, one of the surest signs that a club was going to be torched was when the owner went in and removed all the liquor the night before. Another piece of evidence that I obtained with an FBI Freedom of Information request is this memo that was generated to recount an anonymous tip by a man who was on a flight and was seated next to some men from Kentucky who talked about burning the club, and they were talking about burning the club weeks before it happened. They had a lot of specific knowledge about the Shillings, about the club, and about the mob, and it seems to indicate in this memo that they had an inside guy. Some of the criminal evidence, again, just scraping the surface here, was the Shillings received a threatening letter and cut out letters, just as you see in the movies, saying, "We burn you down once, we'll burn you down again. You keep building, we'll keep burning." This letter was verified by an investigation in the 1990s by the state of Kentucky. Another piece of evidence was that many witnesses described two men who described themselves as air conditioning workers working in the ceiling of the zebra room the day of the fire. However, the zebra room had no air conditioning. There was significant damage to the air handling equipment and scorch marks on the basement walls below the zebra room, and there was immediate destruction of that room where the fire originated. A firefighter who was there that night with his family as a guest said, "Fires that are accelerated act this way. I have never in all my life seen a normal fire travel like this." There were also reports by club workers that day of crew that was wiping down walls in the Hall of Mirrors with a milky liquid that may have been an accelerant. That's significant because the Hall of Mirrors was the conduit by which the fire raced from the zebra room into the cabaret room, where nearly all of the lives that were lost were there for the John Davidson concert. Busboy David Brock also has first-person testimony that he was told by Dick Schilling, "They burned me out." And we have the memo from the FBI that talks about the tip 2 weeks before the fire. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis, Marilyn Monroe, Phyllis Diller, Don Rickles, Jerry Lee Lewis. The names of stars is long and very impressive. The Beverly Hills was unmatched, and it was really something to behold. So we should remember the glory years and the victims. This menu from the glory years is signed by Ozzie and Harriet, who performed at the club. Finally, here's a picture again of the cover of the book, which I'm very happy with. My designer, Andy Melchers, did a great job on this. It just sort of combines the whole imagery of what happened, the mob, the gambling, the fire. One of the readers who has seen this book and was there that night is Jeff Ruby, and he said, "Thank you for telling this story. It fills in the blanks that the investigators didn't want the public to know." So thank you for being with me through this tour of our true, recent, not so far away local history. It's a very exciting story, and I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you get a copy of the book and learn more, because I've only brushed the surface. I'd be glad to take some questions.
This is Sierra chiming back in. I don't see any questions on our page. If you have questions, if you're watching this later, you can leave comments on the video and then I will get them to Peter, or you can also reach out to him at the chilidogpress.com if you want to get in touch with him with any further questions or follow-up questions. I just wanted to thank him again for coming onto the show today and telling us about the history of Newport. It's quite interesting, and sharing his new book with us. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we sign off? I think his video went out. Let me see here. All right. It looks like I've lost his video, but that's all right. We will, if you have, like I said, if you have any questions, we can answer them on the page here. I'll get them to him once he comes back on, or I'll forward them on and we'll answer here in the comments, or you can reach him at thechilidogpress.com. Let's see if I can get him back on the video. I think we're just having a slight technical difficulty here. I don't see him. Okay. I see a couple comments came in. I will forward those questions on to him, and we will get back to you in the comments. So like I said, thank you again for joining us, and we will see you again on today is December 4th, so December 18th at 10 a.m. We will have another local history and genealogy live presentation. Deborah from our department is going to talk about winter holiday nostalgia and traditions in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky. So thank you for joining us. And if you want more information, I just saw your comment. You can go to the website, which is chilidogpress.com. And I also put a link to that up in the earlier comments. All right. Thanks for joining us today.